Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to CNE Online. I'm Andrew Robinson, the Program Manager, Center for Nonprofit Excellence in Charlottesville. Today we're going to be talking about navigating workforce alternatives. We, as we're all aware, are in a situation where layoffs and furloughs are, if not happening already, real possibilities for folks. And we want to support people as they're making these decisions, often tough decisions about how to organize or reorganize their staff during this time. I'm going to send a link around with other upcoming trainings that we have, so keep an eye out for that in a minute. A couple of things just as we get started. If you haven't already done so, it's helpful if you open up both your participants window and your chat window. You can find those in that bottom menu. If you haven't done so already, you can change your name to reflect your real name. I see that I haven't done that myself, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to add in my pronouns. Feel free to do that if you'd like as well, and my organization, so folks can see where I'm from. And I think that although we're a small group, we're going to use the chat function for questions along the way. There is going to be a breakout session later on where we have a chance to connect with some other folks in the room, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. And I think that Jennifer is willing to hang around a little bit if people have questions that go past the 2 o'clock time. That's all I have, and otherwise I'm going to hand things over to Jennifer.
Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to see everyone. So as Andrew mentioned, we will be talking about navigating the workforce. And I know everything seems to have felt like it was flipped on a dime, right? We were going about our lives and very surprised for the response that we've had to have. So hopefully you're starting to enter into this, what we call new normal. But today we're going to talk about some alternatives and things to think about as you're navigating this new world and your workforce. So as Andrew mentioned, I am the owner of Strategic Compensation Solutions. My consulting company focuses on HR needs. I also specialize in the field of compensation. So today I'll be talking with you about total rewards. You can obviously visit my bio on my website, strategiccompensationsolutions.com. But I think what I want to relay most about myself is that I have a strong passion for helping nonprofits, small local businesses. I participate with Charlottesville Chamber because I'm very passionate about sharing knowledge and empowering businesses to be able to make compliance and wise decisions. So that's what the focus today will be about. So I like staying true to the learning objectives that you signed up for. I think it's important that we cover all the topics that you were expecting to learn. So today we're going to talk about what is a furlough and what are the key terms that you need to consider when you're thinking about this option. The second is about layoffs and how does that differ from other workforce management methods. It's important to know the difference between the two. If you are thinking about either of these or going down the path of impacting your employees through furlough or layoffs, what are some ways that you communicate? We're going to have an opportunity for a breakout session to talk about creative communication. I think communication is the most important thing that we're facing during this time, so that everyone can be on the same page and understand what's going on. And then we'll go into a separate topic more around total rewards and talk about, okay, so we've got a workforce that we're keeping, and how do we engage that workforce? What is the importance of the benefits and pay and engagement options that we have? And then lastly, we'll talk about how can you plan for a stronger workforce as you move forward? What are some key steps or 5 different things that you can think about in order to do that? Okay, so let's start off by talking about a furlough. You may have seen this in the news. A lot of companies have talked about putting their employees on furlough. So I always like to go to the dictionary to find out what is the formal definition of this so that we're all on the same page. So the formal definition is to cease to employ a worker, often temporarily. So what does that mean? Ultimately, it's a way for businesses to be able to adjust to economic factors for a short period of time. One example of a furlough or a business that might need to furlough is if you had a hair salon, for example, that you plan on closing just during the restriction times of COVID, but you plan to reopen again with the exact same staff, you just need some short time, that would be a furlough. So some key items to think about when you're thinking about a furlough. It typically is a set amount of time. We're going to talk about layoffs next, but when you're talking about furloughs, it's typically predefined in a short period. This also means that no rehire will be required because while the employees aren't being paid, they're still going to stay on your books and on your payroll. So typically benefits will stay intact. You are not separating the employee from your payroll when you put them on furlough. You would typically reduce their hours, or you would tell them, you know, for 3 weeks time, we don't need you to report, so you won't be paid. One of the things I want to point out, I'm going to talk a little bit about this more on a future slide, but just being aware, if you are planning on doing a furlough for employees, be mindful on whether they're exempt or non-exempt. So what I mean by that is, are they hourly or are they on a salary? It's important to be mindful of this because that impacts what you can do for a furlough. On hourly employees or non-exempt employees that can earn overtime, they can be reduced for a day even. They can be reduced for even several hours. If you're talking about an exempt or a salaried employee, the Department of Labor requires you to do it by the week. So you can't just do a portion of hours in that case, because as we know with exempt workers, they're paid for the quality of their work and for what they're doing for that entire week, regardless of the total hours. They don't receive overtime. And so therefore you won't be able to just do a quick reduction for the day. If they work any part of that week, they will need to be compensated. So just be aware of that when you're thinking about a furlough. Typically on a furlough, employees also do not seek additional work, because keep in mind this was intended to be a temporary solution. And the duration should be no longer than 60 to 90 days if you're doing them in chunks of time. The reason for that is there are specific laws around what constitutes a layoff, and when you start going around that time period, you're going to get a little pushback legally on if you're really in a furlough. So those are some key items when you're thinking about a temporary situation to maybe stop work for employees for a temporary amount of time. The second portion of what I want to talk about is a layoff. Again, you've probably heard this in the news. It's actually something that's used pretty frequently by businesses that need to have an amount of time of separation for their employees. So again, back to the dictionary, I thought it was comical. That's why I put it in here. So their definition of layoff in the dictionary is to put a worker on furlough. So I don't know why people are confused at all, right? When we enter in these things. That is the world we live in. So that's why we have these webinars. So let me provide some clarification since the dictionary is not going to help us. A layoff is typically something that a company will do to lay off or terminate their employees when they expect the time period to be longer than 3 months. So an example I like to use, near and dear to our hearts, are wintergreen. Every season they go through this process where, you know, in the wintertime, they'll need to have ski instructors. Obviously in the summer, they will not. So to separate their employees makes the most sense. They do, you know, maybe someday they'll bring them back. But in general, the plan is to be separated for more than 3 months. And so that is typically called a layoff. So it's a more permanent separation. So the key terms or key items to remember in a layoff is that you're actually removing them from payroll. This can be temporary or it may be permanent, but regardless, a rehire is required. So again, think about that. If you have seasonal employees, oftentimes they're temporary. They may be separated, however, once that time comes for them to roll off, that would be a layoff. Also, pay and benefits cease. So if you're held because the number of employees by your COBRA notifications, they would receive that. They would no longer be eligible or on your payroll for additional benefits. In the case of layoffs, doesn't matter if they're exempt or non-exempt, they're both treated the same because you're terminating their employment. When you have a layoff, typically those employees should seek new work. And oftentimes you'll find that companies will provide severance, they'll provide outplace services because they expect their employees to seek additional employment. And lastly, if qualified for comparisons on a future slide, to note that in the past, prior to our world of COVID-19, you did a furlough, they typically were not eligible for unemployment because it was such a short time and such a short duration that they were planned to be brought back and they never actually separated. During COVID, however, employees can now apply for unemployment, whether they're on layoff or furlough. But I wanted to put that on the slide that layoffs, because that is permanent in nature, typically, that those employees have always qualified for unemployment. Okay, so this is a slide that I've used, I use on my social media. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram and Facebook, because I feel like it's a great side-by-side to quickly go through and see visually the differences between furlough and layoff so that you know what you're using. It's been interesting, again, to watch through the news when I see some organizations using furlough, because I think, oops, they probably meant to do a layoff. So again, you'll want to be really mindful of between the differences of these two so that you're doing the right thing for your organization. So as a reminder, furlough is typically a temporary stop work arrangements. There's typically a planned return to work date. On a layoff, that's the full separation from the company. Benefits should be paid out because they're going to be ending. It's really important to remember that during a furlough, because they're still on your books, they can use other leave types in order to stay whole. But on a layoff, no, that's the end of their employment. If the employee is brought back, they would need to go through the rehire process. On furlough, again, you're going to stay on that payroll. There may be reductions of hours, or it might be blocks of weeks or months perhaps, but you will anticipate a return time. On a layoff, you need to be mindful because of the separation that you might fall under the WARN Act. Okay, so I don't know if anyone's heard about the WARN Act, but it's something that's been really brought forward in the news. And I would encourage you to look up this information on Department of Labor's website because they've done a great job of updating this act information. So it's the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification. So what that typically means is that you have to provide a 60-day notice for 100 plus employees, if you have 100 plus employees, or if your separation is going to be at least 6 months. I bring this up because you may start under furlough and it goes on so long that now you're facing a layoff. So you just need to be mindful again that when you use a furlough, that it's a limited time, that you aren't exceeding the time period that would push you into a layoff and push you into laws or compliance that would be impacted by layoff. So very important to note that the WARN Act applies specifically to the notice that you are to provide your employees when they're receiving a separation. While it may not be required for your company, if you are doing a layoff, if the WARN Act doesn't apply to you, I still recommend that you're very clear on communicating the layoff and that you do provide advance notice as much as possible to your employees that they will be impacted, because it goes back to that value system and how we want to treat people. So I just want to call that to note. The WARN Act, there's a lot of nuances to it. There's some debate even now on whether the WARN Act can cover things such as unprecedented times that we're in, or acts of God as it's been described. But all that being said, I think it's very important that you're mindful of the communication, you're mindful of the time period, and you're mindful of the impact to the employees. So continuing on, so furlough, again, those people typically would not be seeking work during that time because it's a temporary situation. They expect to be called back. And now they can receive unemployment. However, in the past, typically because they're on payroll, they did not. Layoffs, again, you're separating them. You would typically provide some sort of notice and also provide maybe outplacement services or severances because you're really encouraging those employees to seek other employment but they are eligible because they are separated for unemployment. So this is a quick visual side-by-side. And again, we're gonna provide this information to you so that you can have it, but it's just a quick checklist for you to be able to see the difference between the two. Communication tips. Like I mentioned when we started this, I believe that communication is the #1 key when you're managing your workforce, because everyone wants to understand what is happening to them, whether it's an employee, whether it's the management, whether it's leadership. It's really important that communication occurs at all levels, because that also it helps with the engagement. If people are feeling scared about the world around them, they at least want to know what's happening with their employer, and what they should be doing to make their best personal decisions. So these key tips really are around furlough and layoff, and thinking about how do you communicate these type of changes that may be happening in your workforce. The first one is, I strongly suggest that your employee handbooks are up to date. The reason for this is because if you have policies around seeking additional work outside of their current role, like that should be well defined, so that if you put someone on furlough, they know whether or not they're even allowed to do that. Or conflicts. So, you know, if you have someone that's seeking an employment that might be in conflict to your company and they're just on furlough, that's something that we need to know. So I really encourage you to check your employee handbook, make sure that it's up to date, because those policies now more than ever, especially if people are facing furlough or layoffs, those will be utilized or asked about more frequently. So you want to make sure that those are up to date to your current standards. Secondarily, ensure that any policies that you have regarding furloughs, layoffs, and terminations are up to date. Again, there's sometimes a debate. I see a lot of times employees confused on if they're in a layoff and they are terminated, do they get their PTO paid out? When do their benefits end? So it's really important that if people are facing this, that they have a policy that everyone's treated the same, and that everyone can refer to that information very quickly to know what the standard is for your organization. So that's the second piece. Third, I highly recommend that you provide clear written communications to employees for all of your notifications on whether they are in a situation of a furlough or a layoff. Your written communications should include when they're expected to return, if at all, what the anticipated impact is, perhaps to their pay. Be very clear for employees, and I think written is the best way to go. You can always hold additional one-on-one conversations or town halls or things of that nature. However, you know, sometimes when you're receiving that information verbally, it can be shocking or confusing. So having written communication that someone can refer back to is very important. It also provides a legal documentation for you to be able to say, here's what was communicated, so that the employee knows, okay, I'm being treated fairly, and this is the standard that I should expect for my job. So I think it's really important, again, to make sure that your communication is clear for employees so they know what to expect. And again, it gives you an opportunity to reinforce your policies or where your information can be found. And then lastly, as you're facing furloughs or layoffs, and maybe you're making determinations within departments or within roles, be aware of protected classes and ensure equity when you're making decisions. So by that, what I mean is maybe you're an organization and you decided, you know, we're going to outsource our housekeeping. It's not a primary importance for our company and we need to face some cuts. So we're going to do some layoffs to our entire housekeeping department. That's great. It's an entire group. It's very clear that it's not impacted by age or race or gender. And so that's a situation that, again, you want to look at, okay, am I looking at just individuals and saying, well, you know, let's get rid of Tom because I don't know, he does too much around here. You know, that's not what you want to do. You really want to look from a business perspective and then go back and say, okay, are we inadvertently perhaps impacting protected classes? Are there anything that we should be aware of when we're making this decision? Is it truly due to our bottom line in the business and what we need to do to function? So again, I know a lot of times those decisions aren't intended to have a bias to them, but it's something to be mindful about as you look at who is being impacted by furloughs or layoffs and just making sure that they're being treated equitably. So one of my favorite quotes for HR in general, but definitely during this time, history is that certainty produced at the point where the imperfections of memory meet the inadequacies of documentation. And I love that because, as I mentioned, sometimes when verbal discussions happen, people remember it one way, another person will remember it another way. So to avoid any of those situations and relying on memory, it's really best to document and think about your communication methods as you're facing this, because we know it's very serious when someone is facing a furlough or layoff. You know, we're already in unprecedented times of trying to worry about keeping our family safe, keeping ourselves safe and healthy. And so just anything you can do to be clear and allow people to make some choices for themselves, it's really the best route to go. So communication truly is key. So I've been talking a lot, and I know from attending webinars that I always find it much better to interact with my peers and to have a moment to digest. So far, as far as our learning objectives, we've talked about what is a furlough and what are some of the key things to think about. We talked about a layoff and how does that differ from a furlough. What do we need to know or think about in terms of compliance when we're thinking about layoffs. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about how to communicate a workforce change. So what I'd love to do now is to move into breakout groups so that you can talk with your peers on what are some creative communication approaches that could be used to ensure that the employees are understanding these workforce changes that you're planning. And then how can you continue to model your values through these process? There's a lot of different ways that you can communicate, especially in today's world of technology. So I'd love to hear the different ideas of maybe things that you've experienced, or maybe some creative approaches that you've really felt have exemplified your organization's value to your employees. So I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes to have those group discussions, and then we'll come back and share those before we move into the next section of total rewards. So I'd love to have, if there were maybe 2 group representatives, one from each group, share with us what you talked about as far as answering these 2 questions. I'd love to hear the different breakout ideas that came up. Are you guys able to unmute?
So Jennifer, this is Barbara. How are you?
Hi, Barbara. I'm great. How are you?
Good. So our group was Angela and Ken, and we only got through the first question. But bottom line is varying methods of communicating with staff at this point in time. Whether they're just starting out employing the structure, or at this point in time, there's no need to break it down and deliver any hard news. So one is email, possibly large town hall type meetings. Another is weekly team meetings or staff meetings, and then individual touch base meetings with each employee. But the varying sizes of the organizations, one was 300 people, the other one was, like a dozen. So it's not like there's a whole lot of, so that was a wide range. But at the point in time when it becomes necessary to have, if they had to communicate furlough or layoff, obviously strategies would change to make sure each employee understood what was going on. So Ken or Angela, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you got that.
No, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important point. The criticality of the message, it definitely determines your vehicle. I've been through a lot of organizational change where if you're really not impacted or there's nothing much going on, it definitely can be a broader message, nothing to worry about, reassurance maybe from the leadership in a form of an email. But if you're facing something definitely more serious, such as a layoff or furlough or some action that could potentially terminate your role or impact your money, that's really when people want to have the opportunity to ask more questions. And so that's a really good point, is the criticality and impact will influence what medium you're using. Good point, good discussion. How about the second group?
Well, I was in a group. I think other people were muted. I really couldn't hear anyone, but just in my own experience, we went through an organizational restructuring right before all of this. So in the January, February timeframe, and we're a very small staff. And so it kind of went through the process you were talking about with layoffs. It was looking at our administrative functions and really just trying to lean things down and make some improvements and save some money. But we set one-on-one meetings just because of how small the staff was. A lot of them have been working there for many, many years. And I don't know if it's really pertaining to this session. One thing I didn't anticipate was an extreme emotional reaction from one particular employee. I kind of had a feeling, I knew there would be some fireworks there, but I did have another witness there. So because, again, our staff is so small, I kind of went back and forth. Do I have like some other person from outside the organization there? And I just didn't want to create a whole antagonistic environment, but it was just hard. It was really hard. And, she went through a lot of emotional things and did not end well, but we got through it. So again, just because of the size and nature, we did one-on-one, kind of sat down, read the same kind of script for each person and gave them an opportunity to ask questions.
Yeah, Danielle, that's a really good experience explanation. It definitely depends on the individual and what you have to convey. And that could be a whole nother session, right? We could probably spend an hour on that alone, and some of the trauma stories I'm sure that many have been through, whether receiving information or having to give the information. And I think that's where, again, modeling your values and having that anchor of documentation really helps, because it is an emotional thing that people are experiencing, and just being aware and empathetic to that. I feel like people are more aware through this crisis of empathy and reiterating values and bringing the human aspect back into work. And that's refreshing to me to see as a human resource leader, because I lived through the days of the Circuit City headquarter layoff, termination, shutdown. And I can tell you there wasn't much humanity in that. And that was many, many years ago. And to see now how people are handling communication and relaying their values, I think it's so important, because even as a customer, I'm getting emails from Kroger or Home Depot sharing what they're doing for their associates, because as a customer, I care. I want to know how they're treating their employees. And so, again, just being mindful as we have those one-on-one conversations, they are personal, and they can truly cause an emotional reaction. So structuring how that conversation goes, having another witness or even security at times may be necessary for that communication. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we are going to move on because we have such meaty content. So let's talk a little bit, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about those employees that you're keeping. So maybe you've gone through restructuring, you said, hey, we're gonna have to do some furloughs, we're gonna have to do some layoffs, but you're still gonna have a crew, you're still gonna have your employees. So let's talk a little bit more on the positive side about engagement. I've gotten a lot of questions about what is an essential employee. So again, let's go back to that base point of the dictionary. And it says of, relating to, or constituting essence, or of the utmost importance, basic, indispensable, and necessary. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that your employees that are deemed essential are truly essential or necessary for the functioning of your business. The part that I find interesting is that Virginia has recognized a very specific class of employees related to COVID, and I've listed those here. But I think as organizations, we're all looking and saying, hey, who are our essential employees? let's also think about who has to physically be here and who can work remote. And let's re-examine our workforce. So as you do that and you deem who is essential or how are those jobs now being utilized for all boots on the ground, the first thing you want to do is make sure you have accurate job descriptions. And the reason for that is because if you're calling someone in to your workplace and saying you have to be here, you'll want to make sure that it's clear why that person was deemed as such. I highly recommend that you do your determinations of essential employees based off of their role, not off of people. And while it's tempting to say, you know, Joan is a great admin and she keeps this place running, the reality is if her role or job description and what she's getting paid for doesn't make that clear, then she may have some pushback on whether she physically needs to be there and is she truly the one that keeps the lights on. So just make sure that if you deem someone essential and you're having those conversations that they have to be physically someplace or they have to constantly be on, just be clear on their role and document it well within their job description. Like I mentioned before, I think we are entering a whole new world on whether people can work remotely or not. I would strongly encourage you to examine, is there a physical need that they have to physically be in a certain location? We're in a new world where there's a lot of technology that's available. So really take the time to examine, is this truly a physical need or is it just business as usual? This pandemic gives you a chance to think about your workforce and maybe craft new ways for people to work so that you can have business running regardless of what's happening. I want to call out the total rewards model. Again, I could spend all day on this. I have such passion about total rewards. But essentially, external influences such as the labor market or economic influence, regulatory or cultural norms, all impact your strategy for addressing total rewards. So when I talk about total rewards, that is compensation, benefits, work life, performance management, talent development, your recognition programs, and all those go into attracting and retaining your employees. That's why we pay people. That's why we have the benefits. With nonprofit work and hiring employees, it's all about the heart and the values that you bring for your workforce. So all of that combines for employee engagement. So the total rewards model, I have a definition here of each of the areas, and we're really going to spend some time on the compensation, benefits, work-life effectiveness, recognition, and what you can do for those attractions and retentions of those employees that you want to keep during this challenging time. Employee engagement is so important. I think we all know this, but it's oftentimes, I think, refreshing to see the statistics around them. So 69% of employees said that they would work more or work more diligently if they just felt like their efforts were appreciated. So again, it's one of the things where you have to know that your work is valued in order for you to feel like you're making a difference. And so just being mindful of that alone, 69% of employees felt that way, which is pretty, I think, intense. 14% of organizations actually provide tools or options, which is pretty low when you're talking about reward and recognition. So that's why we're having this discussion today. Talk about some of the things that you can do to increase engagement and think about reward and recognition when budgets are small. And then when asked what leaders could do more in order to improve their engagement, basically people, 58%, just want to receive some sort of recognition or a thank you. Things of that nature go really far. So we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of those things that you can do for your organization. So most companies offer benefits. Obviously, there's increased engagement by offering certain benefits, but I would caution you that they need to be valued by your employees. So what I mean by that is that, pet insurance, for example, has been really hot. It's like one of those things that you can offer and everyone's like, oh, it's so cute, I have pets. But if you don't have pets, you probably won't really care. So if you have a workforce where no one has pets, then that's not a value proposition for them that would attract or retain them. So just be mindful, benefits are expensive. They're typically all on the employer side as far as those costs. So just be aware of what is actually valued by your employees before you go offering a whole slew of benefits that may not apply. There's other things that you can think about that are easy add-on benefits that do not have any cost associated with them. There's places that offer discount programs that are free to enroll, or even Aflac will come to your work and do all the footwork for you. They just need a spot to talk to employees or connect with them. So again, there's a lot of opportunity for value add things if your employees are looking for specific benefit offerings that may have no cost associated with it. So those are excellent opportunities to explore what might be meaningful. And then allow customization if possible of benefit elections or PTO. I'm seeing this more and more where benefits are becoming more customized. And what I mean by that is that some people will have the opportunity, for example, to maybe instead of having a contribution to their retirement, they use that to pay off their student loans. So again, be mindful of IRS regulations and what's allowed and not allowed in compliance, but if you have an opportunity to offer customization for your benefits, it really provides a personal feeling for employees that, again, it shows that the company cares about their individual situation, and it's an easy way to allow that engagement in a way that's a little bit different than just providing the standard package. And then last, ensure that your benefits are conveyed to your employees. So it's really great. I see a lot of companies with huge benefit offerings, especially in the nonprofit arena, where they're paying for medical or maybe they're paying for dental and vision. And the employees don't understand the cost behind that. So I'd really encourage you to look into creating total reward statements. They can be as easy as an Excel spreadsheet. But basically it shows, hey, here's what we as a company are paying towards your benefits, and here's what you're paying towards them. It's just a really easy way for people to quickly see, hey, a lot's being invested in me, and being able to see all those offerings on one page is really important because it does provide additional engagement that otherwise they may not be cognizant of. Another way that, again, you're hearing a lot in the news is around creating either an incentive or bonus program. There is a difference between the two. You'll need to be aware of tax implications for overtime and what needs to be included, what doesn't. But I just want to provide a quick overview of the difference between incentive versus bonus. So an incentive is typically future focused. That's something that can be set up where people have targets that they want to achieve. So maybe you might hit the target fully at 100%, or maybe you'll only achieve 50%, but you do have projected goals and objectives. And so again, it's that future focused on behaviors or outcomes that need to be accomplished. On a bonus, that's a little different because typically it's a static lump sum amount that's awarded as a look back over performance. It can be either a formal program that is year over year, or maybe it's an informal one-time bonus that's awarded, but it's not directly tied to specific goals that are forecasted. It's often on-the-spot recognition. As you read the news, like I mentioned, Kroger, I think Walmart has been doing a lot of bonuses, and the reason why is they can be small amounts, they can be quick on-the-spot recognition, but it's an easy way to say thank you. And people obviously love bonuses, even though I keep seeing people respond to say, oh, I only got $300, but again, you'll want to think about what is the meaningful amount and how do you structure that. But just be clear on whether you are looking at incentive, which is future, or whether you're doing a look back, which is a bonus. So those are two different ways that you can incentivize if you have the funds from a compensation standpoint. So we talked a little bit about benefits. Work life is also important when you talk about engagement. So like what we had talked about a little bit before, workplace flexibility, I think we're all encountering that right now. It's really critical to think about, okay, what can we do for that work-life balance? How can we work differently from home? What is happening in regards to dependent care? I feel like everyone's world has shifted with schools being shut down and daycare is not being open. So again, think about that workplace flexibility and what can you do in order to encourage employees to be able to work in a different way and still be able to contribute to your company and provide extreme value, maybe just in a different way. Another thing is thinking about with work life is the health and wellness of employees. So just being mindful to encourage them, like, yes, you're working from home, but please take 15-minute breaks. Take some time to yourself to breathe a little, get a cup of coffee, walk around. Just again, being mindful of the changes that happen and being respectful of work life can go a long way in regards to people feeling appreciated and recognized. And then lastly, recognition. We talked a little bit about bonuses. or incentive programs and how that can recognize people from a monetary standpoint. But now's the time as well to think about your recognition programs. Within the market, we see service awards, for example, so maybe years of service. Sometimes there's employee of the month. So who has done a great job this month in recognizing. Also, peer-to-peer recognition seems to be really popular right now. So just giving employees the opportunity or the forum to be able to say, hey, my coworker did a really great job, and then sharing that with the team goes a long way in regards to engagement. So there's 3 key areas that I've actually talked about for years, and I just wrote my blog on this because I was reminded that in this time, even as we move into a virtual space, these 3 key areas go a long way in regards to engagement, and they're thank you, food, and fun. So thank you. I think we oftentimes forget just saying thanks is free. You don't need anything other than maybe a keyboard. So, again, just think, how can you send a simple heartfelt thanks? It can either be a phone call, it can be appreciating someone in a Zoom meeting, it can be sending a handwritten note. I mean, we all love getting those type of special, unique appreciation. So just thinking about how can you just say thank you, either to a coworker or to an employee, whether it comes from HR, whether it comes from leadership, whether it comes from their supervisor or coworker. People just like to know that they're appreciated, and taking that time just to say thanks can be really, really meaningful. Again, there doesn't have to be a specific format. Just an easy way to say, thank you, you did a really good job. And it doesn't have to be something that was, you accomplished this goal we've been working on for 2 years. It doesn't have to be that. It may be, hey, you know what, you showed up on time and we ended our meeting early because you were prepared. I just really want to thank you for that. So again, it goes a long way just to say thank you. And like we had seen in the beginning, the stats regarding employee engagement and feeling appreciated are huge. They will give more to your company if they feel like they're valued. And so again, thank you is free, and it's an easy way just to keep that engagement up. Food right now, again, is still a thing. Food is an easy way to make employees feel appreciated, recognized, and let's be honest, it's pretty low cost. For a $10 gift card or a $25 gift card, you can get a lot, as far as delivery nowadays, takeout, contactless delivery, things of that nature are still available. If you're in a nonprofit or an organization that you do have employees still on site that physically have to be there, one tip that I have that I've seen work out really well is if you check with your local bakery, oftentimes they will donate baked goods. Panera does it, Chandler's does it. Sorry for releasing the inside tip, but it's a really great way to, if you physically have employees, to come in and surprise them just by having some pastries in the break room. Again, it's no big deal, but it really goes a long way for people that have to be on site. But you can also find ways to thank people with food remotely. And then also some local restaurants or pizza places will often provide a team lunch for free if you explain, hey, they've really stepped up during this time. It never hurts to ask because, again, a lot of times organizations are looking for ways to give back to the community. And then another fun thing that UVA does, which again with social distancing, I think is sad to see some of these traditions go by the wayside, but they always had leadership provide pancakes and cook in ways which was always fun to walk around to the different stations and see leaders cooking. But, again, maybe do a potluck lunch that's sponsored by a leader or by the boss when we're all back together and that's safe to do. But again, you can do it virtually where you send maybe a $10 gift card to Bodo's. So just something that you can think of to reward people. Food is always a great way. And just surprising people with that is always, I think, a cost-effective way to make people feel recognized. And lastly is fun. I think this topic is super interesting because, again, it's one of those things that we've all been thrown into this new world, and fun has kind of gone by the wayside. But now that we're becoming more normalized with us functioning in the virtual space, there's so much that can be done with team builder activities, and they don't have to take a long time. They can be maybe 10 to 15 minutes. You can do a virtual show and tell. You can do a virtual talent show. I've seen beer tasting at happy hour virtually, which is, I think, even greater than where we used to be, because happy hours kind of made me a little cagey with people driving after having happy hour. Now it's completely safe to do. So that's exciting. We all can drink our wine together. But, you know, again, just have a moment to have fun. Pinterest is full of ideas that you can do with teams. It also can be low tech. You can do, you know, scavenger hunts within your home. I mean, it's very simple. Once we're all back together, I've seen social be a big part of organizations where they form softball teams or play kickball, because again, it's promoting wellness at the same time of team building. So it's just really important, I think, to remember fun. And as an organization, again, we all need those moments because our work is so strenuous and serious, to just take a moment to remember we're all people. And again, it can be free. It's not something that will tax your pocketbooks, but it goes a long way as far as engagement and recruitment too. Because if you know that your company values fun and that it's something that they take the time to acknowledge, you'll want to be a part of that team. So again, I think it's one of those things that's easy to do. Even if you do it for 10 or 15 minutes once a month, it's something that people remember, and it goes a long way as far as retaining talent. Okay, so planning for the future. So we've talked about furloughs and layoffs and being able to communicate the workforce changes that have happened. We've talked about ways from a total rewards perspective to be able to retain or attract employees that are on staff and you plan to keep them. So let's talk about the future and how do we plan to be stronger. So I think there's 5 key areas to think about for your organization as we move forward and take all of these things into account. The first one is values. I think especially for nonprofits, like I said, people come to work for nonprofits because of the values, for the give back, for the heart that's displayed. And so just be clear on who you are. Like, who you are is great. And the people that want to work for you, as long as they understand those values, will understand that your behavior aligns to that and they'll really respect it. So just be clear on your workforce values. If you haven't or need to refresh them, now's the time really to think about who do you want to be and who do you want your employees to think you are, and then align all your reactions and communications to that value. So it's really important to think about that now. Second is engagement. So again, what are some strategies that you plan on deploying, not just now, but in the future, for engagement of employees to keep people feeling like it's an atmosphere they want to be a part of, making sure that they feel like they're in a space that they really want to engage and continue to work for you. One of my favorite things, and that I think is the most valuable employee, is an employee that's worked in multiple areas, because they get the whole picture of your organization. So how great would it be to have someone maybe that starts in one department but moves to 2 or 3 and eventually to leadership? Like, that is the ideal employee. They understand your full vision. They understand different perspectives. So again, engagement is so important. So how do you do that to ensure people are continuing on their career path and really growing? Third is workforce design. I think now more than ever is really your time to look at what is your organizational structure. So do those FTEs make sense? Do you have some unnecessary overhead or some hierarchy that really needs to be flattened? Now's the time. I think employees are expecting you to look at your organizational design and make sure that you're up to date with where you want to be. But that really allows you to be streamlined and fiscally responsible. So I'd encourage you to look at your workforce design. Next is evaluation. Like I mentioned on one of the other slides, I think it's really important. Like, pay and benefits are great, but let's be honest, they're so expensive, and they're the most expensive cost to any organization, no matter who you are. That's why I always focus on compensation, because I can help any organization streamline their pay and benefits, because that is where the bulk of your money is going to go. So think about it. Who are you now? Where do you want to be? What's your compensation structure? What is most fiscally responsible, and does it fit to your business strategy? Because if it doesn't, you're wasting money. Those are resources that could be put in someplace else. So really take some time to do some workforce evaluation to make sure your pay and benefits align well with your business strategy. And then lastly, workforce execution. Like, all these things of exploration and theory are really great, but unless you can actually execute, it's not going to do anything for you. So now's the time to make sure all your documentation's in order, make sure your job descriptions are up to date, make sure your policies, your handbooks, all of those hard execution points for your processes are functioning well, because that will position you for the future to be able to say, hey, this works from an efficiency standpoint, or here, this doesn't work. And it all works together to be able to be the best functioning organization that you can be. But you've got to have those concrete items also intact. Okay, so we've gone through a lot today, and like I mentioned, want to hold myself accountable and make sure I serve you. So we've talked about what a furlough is and the definition around that, and layoff. We've talked about the communication of both of those hard messages. Now we've talked about the creative approaches to total rewards and what can you do for free or even low cost. And then lastly, we talked about how can we plan for our new workforce so that we're even stronger as we move forward. So hopefully you feel like you've gotten all the learning objectives today. I am always available for questions. I'm very passionate about the Charlottesville community. So anything you may think of after this, I'm happy to answer. I have my website, and I also have a blog called Staying Strategic, and I update that weekly, and I cover different topics. Some of the things we've talked about here, you'll find more details on my blog, but I'm also on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest under Strategic Compensation Solutions. So I'd really encourage you to interact with me on those communities too, for real-time questions, ideas, and I find it's a really easy way for my clients to stay up to date on news articles or things happening. I always flag out regulations or compliance that you need to be aware of. So hopefully that makes it easier for you to be able to just have an information stream coming to you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I'm going to open things up for questions. I just wanted to make sure people notice I just added a link in the chat there, so you can take a minute to fill out an evaluation form and let us know what you thought of the session and how we can improve for future online trainings. Are there any questions? I think people should feel free to unmute themselves and join in. And I will unmute the folks who are on by phone so that they're able to actually join in the conversation this time.
Hey, Jennifer, this is Barbara Kessler. I have a question about board's involvement in supporting, whether it be the ED, executive director, or if there is an HR professional with all of this during, as an organization looks to what do they, what do they look like going forward? Because I know, right now, if people got PPP, that's like a holding pattern, right? But it's really about what will the organization continue to be, the programs and services delivered, and therefore what's the team that's needed, and financially, how can they sustain themselves? So do you have any guidance in terms of, because I think a lot of boards do try to get either HR or lawyer on the board or something like that in order to help with some of the people stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barbara. You must be like in the sync with my mind, because I was actually talking about that yesterday, because it's so interesting how the structure of the board and how it functions impacts that broader community. I've sat on boards where the executive, I'll just say executive manager or the person on staff really functioned independently, and it was almost an upflow to the board as a report up, but they really handled the people, and it felt more like the board was part of just the outreach of, keeping engines running. I've had the opposite experience where the board has actually driven the immediate behaviors, objectives, day-to-day feedback of that executive manager, which is pretty intense. And they had, as you described, an attorney on board, an HR director on board to guide those sort of things. So I would encourage you to first think about how are you structured, because that, means a lot. Secondarily, though, I still think regardless, the board is important from a values perspective. So some of these things we talked about around engagement still can happen because we're all people. And so just knowing that they're there to support, whether you have either scenario, the top down or down up, I think is really important. And it's really important to be connecting with that executive manager to find out what's really going on. And maybe now's the time to have some of those crucial conversations so that you can position yourself better in the future. Because oftentimes the board is trying to provide guidance or maybe make strategic decisions through votes, and yet they may be disconnected from what's really happening in the day-to-day. So just being able to connect those two, and I think it starts with engagement and being able to have that good relationship. So yeah, it's a little bit of my professional and personal experience. I hope that helps.
Great, thank you.
Is there any other questions? Well, I will say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and a big thanks to Jennifer for taking the time to share her expertise and experience with her. I will, in a follow-up email, include the video for this, the slides, some of our HR-related COVID resources that we've compiled, as well as a recent webinar that we did specifically on remote work, if you're all interested in that as well. So that should be coming in the next few days. If you do have further questions, feel free to reach out to Jennifer. Feel free to reach out to me or other CNE staff. We're always here to help. And thanks again for coming.